All right. So as you can see, I'm going to speak with you about Donald Trump's foreign policy today. And before I do that, I'll just for a moment say that, like many of you, the thing that I was focused with horror on for much of this week was the killing of a National Guardsman, the grave wounding of another one who is still apparently battling for his life in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the week by an Afghani asylum seeker, by all accounts, a man who was
That's
seriously suffering
right.
from
Policy,
some
right?
of the trauma. I'm just going to mute the background because I'm getting a little
Are there?
sound.
We know.
There we go. So little bit of I'm sorry, got the background under control. Suffering from serious trauma associated with work that he did at the behest of the Afghani government, but with the cooperation of the United States during the American occupation. And I want to be, direct and clear about this. I don't like the presence of National Guards troops in our nation's capital. I don't think there's any good policy rationale for it. I also really hate the optics of what appears to be a military occupation of the capital of our country as a quote crime fighting operation. It doesn't make any sense to me before we even begin about the security implications, the idea that we may be putting our troops in harm's way, we may be making them targets, as we now know there was some discussion of prior to the events of this week. Having said all of that, the man and the woman who were ambushed and killed or severely injured at the beginning of the week do not make this policy. They are merely there because they are trying to serve their country and because they're ordered to be there. I think we should have the utmost of compassion and sympathy for their families, even if we dislike the policy that brought them there. I'll say then just a little bit about the politics as opposed to the humanity of this situation, which is just right. I hope clear cut sympathy for the individuals and their families as they suffer. Um, in terms of policy, it is clear that Donald Trump is using the attacks of the last week to reinforce, to double down on his policy of preventing immigrants from
Boards
coming
with
to the United
regulatory
States.
authorities or to
And
capture the Supreme Court, as we've spoken about.
also, sorry,
We
I'm not quite sure what's happening there.
know.
Somebody, if you're not if unmuting yourself deliberately, then I don't think you control it. But please, if you are unmuting yourself, only do that when there's a question or when you want to be directly in contact. So the idea that Donald Trump is using the tragedy of last week to redouble his efforts to prevent immigrants from getting to the country, including asylum seekers, including people from countries like Afghanistan, where the United States has a heightened moral responsibility, given the fact that we enlisted the residents of this country to collaborate with us in our occupation, and then ultimately, right, that government fell, was replaced by another government who was targeting those people as a result of their perceived complicity with the occupation. We have a special obligation to get those people out of the country. But the deeper issue here, right, as we see not only the effort to keep migrants out of the country, but also to deport the people who are here, both legally by changing their status, for instance, suspending or completely revoking temporary protected status, as happened in the last week, or right, simply going after people who have no criminal record and who are here honestly because our immigration system is broken and because our economy needs them. The fact that this is damaging Donald Trump, right? Damaging his approval rating, damaging probably his power with his own party, as the brutality of the tactics being used by ICE and Border Patrol and other federal law enforcement agents in the ways that we've looked at in previous weeks increasingly repels many Americans who might have some sympathy with the policy objective, but who are just horrified by the way in which the policy is being implemented, by the lawlessness, by the brutality, by the indecency of the use of force against American citizens, against immigrants, against undocumented persons who are not criminals, who are not resisting law enforcement, who are engaged in peaceful protest. That has, I think, been one of the major contributory factors to the collapse in Donald Trump's approval rating. And then we note, in addition to that, that there are real economic costs beginning to accrue to the United States from the way in which this policy is being implemented. The fact that we are shrinking the American labor force by a million people who do low income work that many of us rely on and who do it with care and diligence and strength, tremendous work ethic in many cases, and the idea that, right, our economy is beginning to show signs that we need the labor that we are now no longer able to avail ourselves of because we have forced the people out of the country. The further idea that whereas for really the last 40 years, we've always had a net flow of migrants coming to the country, we're now seeing a net outflow of people immigrating out of the country, and that this is contracting demand, right? Because the people who are leaving the country are no longer buying housing, clothes, food, gasoline, other resources in the country. That is impacting us financially. And yet, I don't think Donald Trump can pivot away from this. I think what this week's events show is that he is incapable of doing that, both for political reasons. A substantial portion of his base has been encouraged by him to be so vehemently anti-immigrant that it would be seen as a betrayal, akin to the failure to release the Epstein files if he backtracked on this policy position. But I also think at a deeper level still, the kind of populist politician that Donald Trump is, he mobilizes his base, their support, their enthusiasm by identifying an enemy, an outsider who they can identify as being, right, a threat that needs to be countered by a strongman leader. And for Donald Trump, that is fundamentally and has always been immigrants, people who he views as hostile to this country, as not truly American. And so his entire political identity and brand is built around this kind of hostility and dehumanizing of immigrants. I think it's no surprise that rather than questioning the policy that put the National Guard's troops in harm's way, he is blaming the man who obviously was the assailant and who should be criminally tried, but that he is also generalizing this as a further reason why the United States needs to continue to deport, continue to be more and more hostile to people seeking refugee status or asylee status. And so I suspect this is going to continue to be one of those places where Donald Trump has painted himself into a corner, and there's no good way out for him or for our country. Which brings me to what I really want to talk about today, his foreign policy. And I start with the question, does Donald Trump have a foreign policy? And here I'm sorry for the mistake in the slide. Something happened, words were deleted and crammed together. I don't know what I did, but obviously I messed that up. The question is supposed to be, does Donald Trump have a foreign policy? And in saying that, I start with a very simple definition of what a foreign policy is. A foreign policy is a set of objectives that a country wants to accomplish vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? And so you start with your understanding of your country's interest vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And then it is a strategy for effectively accomplishing those interests that is right realistically adjusted to your power or your other means for accomplishing those goals and your likely collaborators or allies and your likely impediments, obstacles, enemies, rivals in the rest of the world, right? And so there is a sense in which foreign policy has that complex structure and reflects the fact that the world is complex, interconnected, and very often that there are places of fragility as well as impediments that you can't fully perceive until you run into them. Right. And so the question, does Donald Trump have a foreign policy, is meant to ask, does he have that kind of structured worldview that would guide his engagement with the rest of the world? Does he have a team in place that is capable of implementing that kind of structured worldview? And there is a clear, right, objective. The objective is captured in the terms America first, right? And the idea is twofold, that American foreign policy should focus primarily on things that are good for the American people, that it should be a self-serving foreign policy. And here Donald Trump is of the opinion that for far too long, America has served the global order or the building and maintenance of international institutions, alliances, and that we have spent far too much on this and benefited far too little from it, and that the rest of the world has taken advantage of our generosity, and that it is time to correct course, to put America's interests first in our foreign policy. But the flip side, the companion idea without which America First might not make very much sense as a vision for a global foreign policy as opposed to a vision for how you pursue your narrow national interests. The companion idea is that the United States is the largest economy in the world, the most powerful military in the world, the most admired culture in the world, the technological leader in the world, and therefore we have a tremendous power potential that up until this point we have not exercised to our national advantage. And so America First means not only reorienting American foreign policy around national interests narrowly construed, but also using all of our power potential to pursue that foreign policy. And that's the vision, right? I think that's a coherent vision. But the question then of whether or not the power potential that the United States has from having the largest economy in the world, that's objective, from having the largest, most expensive military in the world, the most extensive set of bases and capacities, the strongest alliances in the world. Again, there's an objectivity to that. And from having some of the most advanced technology in the world, from having some of the most influential cultural products in the world, all of this I think is true also. But how much does that translate into our capacity to impose our will on the rest of the world? And here I will note two things very quickly. The first is the very limited success that the United States had in Iraq and Afghanistan in right, not just toppling the governments of those societies, which we did very quickly and with relatively light casualties, reflecting our vast military superiority over the governments, the armies of those countries. But the fact that once we had toppled the governments, it turned out that being able to put something in their place that was more advantageous to the people of those countries, but also to the United States, less likely to be sponsors of terror, less likely to be repressive, more likely to be something like democratic, governed by the rule of law, more likely to be allied with us in the region. That turned out to be devilishly difficult, and it shows the limits of military power. It shows the limits of cultural power. It shows the limits of building institutions in other countries if there are substantial portions of the population and the elites who are not supportive of your project. And then I will add very quickly to just further complicate the picture two additional factors. One of them is that although everything I've just said, characterizing America first, about the strength of our country, it is not the case that the United States is ascending in power. Quite to the contrary, the United States is clearly declining in power, right? And China is, in fact, ascending, and the world seems to be leaving a bipolar and then unipolar phases in which the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively, during the Cold War, and then the United States during the post-Cold War period, were dominant powers, dominated the institutions of international order, dominated military alliances. With China's emergence as the second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest economy in the world, if not the richest per capita, with its growing military might, with its, I think at this point, established technological dominance in many important fields. And then you add to that with new technologies like the drones I have on the screen here that are cheap and appear to be quite effective as an counter to high tech weapons that are extraordinarily expensive, whereas drones are very cheap. The idea that the balance of power in the world is shifting away from the United States and into a much less well organized system diminishes our capacity to use our economic, our military, or our cultural might, our forms of hard and soft power to impose our will on the rest of the world. In a sense, the Donald Trump version of America First foreign policy seems much better suited to the early 21st century than it does to 2025, right? And so the idea that this foreign policy has a clear objective but hasn't identified a strategy for effectively pursuing this objective, and certainly has not adjusted that strategy to the realities of the world. I'll add one additional factor. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge of a factor, but the idea that we live in a globalized age, that some of the most pressing problems facing the world right now, I'm thinking especially of climate change, of artificial intelligence, and of migration, of the flow of people across the world, as well as the susceptibilities that these new technologies generate, whether it's the susceptibility to major pandemics because of the flow of people across the world, or the susceptibility to disinformation and foreign influence in national public spheres due to the way in which we are so integrated in our public sphere. You add this into the mix, and of course the global interconnection of economies, right? And the way in which the right collapse of the housing market in the United States can trigger a global recession, a steep decline in productivity in countries that are far removed from the American housing market, the way in which something similar could happen in China or Europe and drag the American economy down. This is a world in which nations are deeply intermeshed in systems of connectivity that make it very hard for them to operate effectively unilaterally. And so with all of that right in the background, I then have three words to characterize the Trump administration foreign policy such as it is so far. And the first is decoupled. And by that I mean that the United States, which has been tightly coupled with its allies, with international institutions, with the systems of governance that have structured an era of globalization, is pushing away from those institutions, is seeking to decouple itself from those relationships, from those alliances, from the support that the United States has furnished. One of the clearest examples of this is that the COP30, the Conference of Participants of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, just concluded in Brazil, I think in a way that was highly disappointing. And the United States simply was not participating in it. So the idea that in very many places, part of America first is right, America only participating in those institutions that this administration judges are to its advantage, and that means pulling back from and even undermining many international institutions. Out of the box is my second characterization. And so I have images that represent the peace plan for Gaza, which, as I think you're aware, a couple of weeks ago was adopted by the United Nations Security Council with the right abstention of China and Russia, but everybody else voting in favor of it. It's a unanimous decision-making body, and it now becomes international law, the Trump peace plan for Israel and Gaza. And obviously, it's a peace plan that is very different from the kind of peace plans that have often been negotiated in the past. It is out of the box in the sense that it specifies highly ambitious goals, right? The demilitarization, not just of Hamas, but of Gaza altogether, a two-state solution, substantial economic development for Gaza without, right? We discussed this maybe a month ago, a great deal of detail about how that's actually going to be accomplished. And it was essentially imposed in a moment of weakness on both Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu's government, not a conventional approach to peacemaking in the Middle East. And then, by the way, the fact that we are blowing up boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific without having declared war, without having any real pretext under international law to treat this as legal. The idea that Donald Trump apparently is pardoning a former president of Honduras who's serving 45 years, essentially a life sentence, given how old he is, for right having participated in narco trafficking. Right, this is unconventional foreign policy, out of the box. It really represents the fact that I will be direct about this. I think America First is clearly Donald Trump's framework for thinking about foreign policy. But having said that, it is also the case that Donald Trump has not, the way that many presidents have, spent a career thinking about foreign policy issues. He comes to this relatively late in his career, and he comes to this without, I think, having the kind of background, the kind of information, the kind of careful study that other presidents have. Or to put it differently, if they don't have that experience, they surround themselves with a team that does. Being out of the box is in part a product of being able to think freshly because you aren't part of the foreign policy establishment and haven't surrounded yourself with people who are. But it also lends his thinking a kind of instability, a kind of off the cuff and mercurial. If it comes to him on a Friday afternoon that he should intervene in the election in Honduras by pardoning the previous president, that's going to be the foreign policy of the United States. There aren't really channels and procedures. Very much of this is Donald Trump and the last person he spoke to making the foreign policy of the United States. And that gets me to the final description, unhinged, right? In the sense that this is not a stable policy, maybe at all. There may be a stable, overarching strategic goal, but then, right, theater by theater, country by country, issue by issue, this is what Donald Trump decides to do. And the rest of his foreign policy team is left, right, very often surprised and then trying to backfill whatever the idea is that Donald Trump has hit upon, maybe on a social media post late at night. And so this is a very different kind of foreign policy than the United States has ever had. I'll start with the U.S. attacks on Venezuelan boats and the naval buildup around Venezuela. And so this is right, the current state of the strikes on boats that come primarily from Venezuela. And as you can see, and I want you to just note, right, that the majority of the strikes have been in the Caribbean. This is going to be important because the rationale for these strikes is that it is a drug interdiction effort, strategy. And then what matters, of course, is how many drugs and what kinds actually come through the Caribbean from Venezuela. There have been a few strikes also in the Pacific. Again, that matters once we pay attention to the likely channels of transport for drugs. Having said that, I'll just note quickly, I think it's too small for you really to make out, but the death total is now in excess of 80 people. And I want to just note two things that are in the news these days. The first is, that for the most part, many of those 80 people have not been strongly connected to drug cartels. And two things to say about that. The first is that apparently the boats are being targeted because the boats are suspected of being drug trafficking boats. That doesn't mean that everybody on the boat is a drug trafficker. And so the military it's being revealed unsure on the intelligence about who's actually on the boat. And so one way to refer to this is that the other people on the boats may be collateral damage, that the real target of the operation is the drugs, not the people on the boat. But that's a little hard to reconcile with what's being reported just the last couple days, which is that the military was given an order to make sure that there were no survivors in one of the first strikes carried out. We don't know enough to know if this has continued, and that a second missile was fired after the boat had been destroyed to kill the survivors. And here I just have to say, I think this is clearly illegal, possibly, almost certainly, I guess I'll say, criminal, right? Which is to say, there's no declaration of war. If there were a declaration of war that's governed by international standards about who is a combatant and what constitutes an actual action of military aggression, and clearly the people in question are not combatants and the conduct in question is not aggression, and so the United States has no justification for targeting these ships with the military. And I'll just say this very quickly. We have other tools. If we know that these are drug boats, we can use our Coast Guard to apprehend them. And then, by the way, I'll just add very quickly, right, that we have better strategies for dealing with the drug trade. And in particular, that the people who we are killing, right, these are very low level drug mules, right? The term for people who carry drugs for the cartels. These people are being paid a few $100s to engage in a small scale smuggling operation. We are not going to actually put a dent in the drug trade, in the arrival of drugs in the United States. And let me see if I've got this on the next slide. I think I do. Yes, right. There's a reason for us to be deeply concerned about the influx of, in particular, fentanyl into the United States. As you can see, there are large numbers, an epidemic of deaths associated with fentanyl and other synthetic opioids reaching the United States, approaching 75,000 deaths a year. This is a plague, and the people who bring this are a scourge. But the way to stop the flow is not to blow up the boats, which have a small amount of the supply, or to kill the mules who are not integral to these operations. And frankly, these countries are poor enough that they will find other people willing to risk their lives for a few $100s to smuggle the drugs. You add to that, finally, that this is not the main or even a subsidiary way in which fentanyl enters the United States. And you begin to suspect that this is not really about drug interdiction. That's a pretext. And I'll just say this very quickly. I think there are two other better alternative explanations. One of them is that Donald Trump does not like the president of Venezuela. And by the way, he has very good reasons for not liking him, right? The man has stolen an election and should not be in power. The man, right, squanders the tremendous oil wealth of Venezuela and is deeply corrupt and repressive, right? And so the idea that he's not someone that the United States should support or ally with, someone that we should instead oppose and do our best to remove from power, I completely agree with. But the idea that the America First lens, use our power to impose our will on other countries, is giving rise to a militarized strategy that we're using drug interdiction as a pretext for what is really designed to maybe rattle some of Maduro's support. I just don't think it's very likely to work. And here again, we get at the limits of America's power and the need to find, if you will, soft power alternatives, to find ways of working with Venezuela's allies, civil society groups in Venezuela, to impose sanctions. The stuff that is slow and not particularly visible but may be long-term more effective, is right more likely to actually succeed. And here I'm talking about a change of power, a change of regime in Venezuela. And to do so, this is, I think, extremely important without generating chaos or anarchy in Venezuela. If we ultimately, and this diagram on the right shows you, right, the military buildup in Venezuela, right? The idea that we have a tremendous naval presence in the Caribbean off the Venezuelan coast right now. Again, I think designed to intimidate Maduro. But if we ultimately take naval or military action to attack his regime, there's a high probability that we will create the conditions for a failed state or the conditions for anarchy in Venezuela. That's not going to be good for anyone in the region. To have one of the potentially richest states, one of the large population states, a state that's relatively close to us, a state that borders Colombia, where the narco organizations are really deeply rooted, decline into lawlessness. And so this raises the question, what exactly are we doing with these attacks? And here I want to point to one more explanation. And I think that this is extremely important in thinking about the Trump administration, and that it's about optics. It's not rooted in what I'm showing you on this screen, right? If you look at the complexity of, right, the Caribbean drug trafficking operations, very little of it actually comes out of Venezuela on boats. Much more of it goes over land through Venezuela, from Colombia, elsewhere, or right to Mexico and Honduras, right, to get land paths, or via intermediaries, right? It's a much more complicated picture. So why blow up boats in the Caribbean if this is draining the ocean with a teaspoon, if this is not actually an effective strategy? And here I'll just say very briefly, I think it's about the optics. The fact is that fentanyl is very hard to detect and control. Let me give you a little bit more information on this. When we look at where the fentanyl comes from and how it arrives, right? There's a substantial portion of fentanyl coming across land borders in the United States, but an even larger portion of it coming into the United States and Canada and Mexico from primarily China and secondarily India. That the drug trafficking is overwhelmingly done by U.S. citizens, not by illegal immigrants. I hope you can see, but 80% of the people who've been caught transporting fentanyl are American citizens, right? And then you add, by the way, it is primarily smuggled through legal ports of entry. And the port of Los Angeles is probably the most important port here. And the idea that that's a port that gets tens of thousands of cargo containers a day, that fentanyl is very easy to disguise. Its ingredients are hard to detect. It can be smuggled in small quantities, and we simply don't have the capacity to adequately inspect all of those containers. Makes it very hard to interdict. And so, right, what we're doing is something that is visible, is spectacular, blowing up boats. And it lets Donald Trump say on social media, say in the Fox News media system, I'm actually doing something. You've had all these presidents talking about this in the past, but they've been ineffectual. This is me putting America first, using American power to serve American interests, and it sounds good, and it looks good, and it allows him to strike uh, strong, masculine, militarized pose in these right areas of high visibility and low verification, right? You go into social media and anybody can say anything in ways that we've talked about extensively. You go on Fox News and nobody is taken seriously who is critical of Donald Trump. And so the optics win, right? And I just have to be as direct as possible. Again, if you're thinking about cocaine instead of, right, fentanyl, it is clear, right, that a very small portion of it, maybe 8% that goes right through the ocean actually comes through the Caribbean. The vast majority travels via land or air, right? And so this is not actually going to address the opioid crisis, the deaths of despair, the fentanyl epidemic, but it does generate great media, and it does perhaps put some pressure on the Venezuelan government. This leads me next to, and this is really the immediate reason that I'm speaking with you about this today. I don't know if you saw, but yesterday on social media, Donald Trump announced that he was pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, right? That was the man. I can show you very quickly his image, who was on my title screen, right? That's him addressing the United Nations when he was the president of Honduras. And this was done via social media, right? This is right what Donald Trump says, and it's worth looking at the context because I think it helps you to see, in a sense, how disorganized, discombobulated the foreign policy thinking of the Trump administration, but ultimately just the foreign policy thinking of Donald Trump, who appears to be making this policy on social media on his own. So he's trying to intervene in the Honduran election that is happening today, right? And Honduras, just so you conducts its elections in a single vote, right? And single vote for president, and the idea that it's a first past the post system. Whoever gets the most votes wins. And so there are five candidates, three main candidates, and Donald Trump has decided that he wants to support Tito Asfura, who is the right-wing populist, right, who is running to be president. And the idea that the person that he just pardoned, right, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is from the same party as Asfura, and maybe pardoning Hernandez helps Asfura, and maybe it draws attention to Donald Trump's efforts to help Asfura, right? And Donald Trump does understand very well that in the 21st century, we have an attention economy, that drawing attention to what you're doing is half the battle in accomplishing what you want to do, but it's only half the battle. And here I want to suggest that this is most likely to fail. So let's look at what Donald Trump put on his social media account yesterday. If Tito Asfara wins for president of Honduras because the United States has so much confidence in him, his policies, and what he will do for the great people of Honduras, we will be very supportive. If he doesn't win, the United States will not be throwing good money after bad. And so I want to start with the idea, right? This is not the way America, right, tends to express itself when other societies are having democratic elections. The president of the United States doesn't typically try to throw his full weight behind one candidate and threaten the people of the country. If you don't do what I want you to do, then I'm going to punish you, right? And then skipping a little bit further down. Additionally, I will be granting a full and complete pardon to the former president Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has been, according to many people that I greatly respect, treated very harshly and unfairly. And by the way, I have no idea who that is, right? That Donald Trump is hearing that he was treated harshly and unfairly. Please note, right, that the indictment of Hernandez was pursued during the first Trump administration. The evidence that he was engaged in narco trafficking, that he was collaborating with the worst of the Colombian cartels, that he was enriching himself to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars by doing so, it's all very well established. This was a clear cut slam dunk prosecution, and it's not easy to prosecute the president or former president of another country. And so the idea that this just doesn't add up, right? This is I don't know how to explain this other than that this is an effort to attention grab. Frankly, the best case scenario I can think of is it's only a ploy to get attention so that hopefully Donald Trump will be able to push Tito Asfura further up the ballot, maybe even get him the presidency of Honduras. But having said that, um, if he actually goes through with the pardon, as right, Mike Vigil, the former chief of international operations at the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, puts it, this action would be nothing short of catastrophic and would destroy the credibility of the U.S. in the international community, right? The idea that Donald Trump, who's blowing up boats in the Caribbean to fight the drug trade, is at the same time pardoning somebody who was integral to the Colombian ability to get cocaine to the United States is such blatant hypocrisy, and I'm sorry, corruption, in the sense of it undermines the agencies that are engaged in actually doing the hard, diligent, difficult work of figuring out how the cartels operate and the best way to interfere with them. This is why I think, right, people who actually work in this realm, including people in the prosecutor's office in charge of prosecuting Hernandez, are saying they just have no understanding of what's going on here. Why we would let somebody out of jail who is so clearly part of the drug trade. So, in addition to that, right, let's assume that this is a ploy. I think the best case would be Donald Trump doesn't actually go through with it and doesn't pardon Hernandez. That diminishes his credibility. He doesn't actually mean what he says, or he goes off half cocked. But it's better than releasing a major drug trafficker from U.S. jail for no reason other than somebody told him he's been unfairly treated. But I think it's quite likely, I'm not sure, but it may actually already be happening, that Trump is going to pardon Hernandez. And I also think it's entirely likely that even if he does, this ploy is going to fail, right? Asfura is running a distant third in these elections, and people who look at this, people who are expert in this, predict that the person who has the best chance of actually defeating the person who Donald Trump apparently doesn't like, Rixi Moncada, who is the right presidential candidate for the Libre Party, the party that is currently in charge of Honduras, that the best chance of defeating him is the Liberal Party's Nasrallah, but that what Trump will likely do is take votes away from Nasrallah and for Asfara, not votes away from Moncada, making it more likely that Moncada will win. And I'm sorry, I don't know a lot about Honduran politics. I tried to do a little bit of reading to come up to speed to speak with you about this today. But What I would say is that there are people who work in the State Department. There are people who work in intelligence for the US who do know a lot about Honduran politics and who, if the president would have consulted with, might have been able to help him or educate him to better accomplish his goals. But they are probably unlikely to share his goal of furthering the spread of right-wing populism internationally. And I think that's the real bottom line here. Tito Asfuera comes from the same corner of the political spectrum as Donald Trump, comes from someone who wants to be a strongman, right-wing nationalist leader, and J.D. Vance, especially other people in the administration, are trying to further this as an international political movement. And again, I'll just be as clear as possible. On the one hand, there's an exaggeration of American strength and influence. Donald Trump thinks at the last minute he can post something on social media, he can pardon a drug trafficker, and tilt the outcome of the election in Honduras. I find that to be implausible and, in a sense, hubristic, right? It's just misunderstanding the power dynamics. There will be many people on the left in Honduras who will come out precisely because they don't want Donald Trump to throw their election to the wrong person. But it also indicates that this administration has too many competing objectives in its foreign policy. Wait, is it about stopping the drug trade, in which case keep the drug trafficker in jail, or is it about spreading right-wing populism on the international stage, or is it all about optics and attention? And so not a coherent foreign policy, not a cogent policy, not a well thought through strategy for pursuing the America First aims. And so that then takes me, and I'm going to be brief about this for today. I think we can spend more time on this in days to come, into other aspects of Trump's foreign policy and how it's playing out elsewhere in the world. As you are aware, I'm sure, the United States put forward a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine in the aftermath of Russia's invasion, right? And please note, right, that there is growing evidence that that plan was in many ways dictated by Russia, that there is right now recorded evidence that Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer who is Trump's envoy in this conflict, coached the Russians in how to prevent the United States from delivering Tomahawk missiles to the Ukrainians, which would have made right life much more difficult for Putin and the Russian military, which seems to be the best strategy for forcing Russia to negotiate in good faith and not simply continuing to pursue its push into eastern Ukraine. Please note, right, that this push has been slow but successful, especially over the last year, as the Ukrainian military has been worn down by a grinding war of attrition. Ukraine is, of course, a much smaller country with just limits on its manpower as well as limits on its military. The United States has been very uneven and reluctant to supply military equipment since Donald Trump assumed office. And please note, right, that the United States is the chief armor of the Ukrainian military. The Europeans are trying to catch up, but they don't have the capacity that we have. And so Putin seems to have calculated that either he wants to accomplish via a treaty what will take him longer and be much more costly to accomplish via war, but if he can't accomplish it via a peace treaty, he will continue to fight the war, right? And I hope, I don't know if I hope or not, but you probably saw that there was another deadly, sustained bombardment of Ukraine yesterday, last night, while we were sleeping. The bombs were falling on the Ukraine, and so right, the attacks intensify. Negotiations have passed the Thanksgiving deadline that Trump set. There does appear to be some progress, and that the Ukrainians are pushing back. There are important developments in Ukraine's politics as well. Volodymyr Zelensky's right-hand man, his chief negotiator, has had to resign due to a swirling controversy of corruption in the Ukrainian energy sector, not directly related to military, but nevertheless, the feeling was that it could be a vulnerability or a distraction to have him continuing to negotiate if he's at the center of a controversy, and so he's out. And it's unclear who steps in for Zelensky. The fact that Donald Trump, right, proposed this plan that seemed to give Russia everything that it wanted has actually increased support for Zelensky in the middle of this controversy in Ukraine. But I would say, right, that we are in the middle of an extraordinarily important phase in this conflict and in the negotiations around this peace plan, in which Zelensky feels great vulnerability because without the United States support, which today means Donald Trump's support, he is probably much more vulnerable to ongoing Russian advances, territorial gains, than he's been for most of the last 3 years. The Gaza peace plan, I'll be very quick about this, right, has been adopted by the United Nations, but, I don't think I'm going to be able to do much with this with you today in ways that we've talked about together before, right? And I'm trying to get ahead to the slides. This is a 20-point plan with some extremely ambitious goals. And it has become clear since the plan has been announced two things, right? The first, that Hamas is still there and in fact is beginning to reassert its control over Gaza. And right, there seems to be something of a two Gaza scenario right now. The Gaza that is still controlled by Israel, which is the majority of the territory, and the right Gaza that Israel has withdrawn from behind the so-called yellow line, which demarcates the territory that it controls, where Hamas has returned to control. And if I understand the Israeli conservative position correctly, it is to stop the peace plan there. Right. And so that's essentially stage one of a 3 or 4 stage peace plan. And the Israeli right wants to go no further, wants in a sense to let the Palestinians see the juxtaposition between the quality of life in the area of Gaza that Israel controls, as opposed to the quality of life in the area that Hamas controls, in order to persuade the Palestinians to completely abandon Hamas. Um, I don't think it's a great strategy. I don't think it's a very realistic strategy because, of course, it's going to court ongoing military conflict with, right, the two groups side by side, separated by a simple yellow line on a map. The idea that the UN climate conference just ended without making substantial progress or any real new pledges, that in that sense it was a defeat. The idea that the United States was not participating in it, the idea that AI is galloping ahead without being regulated at all, that tariffs continue to disrupt our economy and the global economy. There's just a tremendous complexity of issues to talk about when talking about foreign policy. And it does seem to me that the framework that the Trump administration brings to this just tangled web of problems is not adequate to outlining clear priorities, to developing clear strategies, to implementing them in ways that take into account the intricacies and the impediments. And so I do think that it is becoming increasingly clear to many people in the world, our allies, our erstwhile allies, and especially those who are rivals or enemies or who think they do better in a world in which the United States is not paying attention or working well, that the United States foreign policy is increasingly in disarray. I'm going to just add one last question, and I'll go back to the apparent pardoning of Juan Orlando Hernandez, right? And the idea that this would be catastrophic, that it would undermine the credibility of the US, that it would be self-defeating for one of the most important objectives that the Trump administration has, which is to somehow protect the United States from the scourge of drugs and the deaths that it's causing. And I would just ask, assuming that Donald Trump really is going to um, pardon, right? Somebody who's been convicted and sentenced already, and for no good reason, right? Other than perhaps to try to, gain attention for a ploy that is almost certain to fail in Honduran politics. And by the way, to intervene in the politics of a right country in our own hemisphere, which is something where we've got a rather bad history with. Is there no bright line for fellow Republicans? Is there nothing that Donald Trump can do that won't that has any chance of discrediting him, or at least opening up some distance, especially in light of the elections at the beginning of November, that make it clear to Republicans that following this president in such tight lockstep has already damaged them. And here I'm just right posing a question that I don't know the answer to, but I'm not optimistic about the idea that there is anything that Donald Trump can do, despite the totally incoherent nature of his foreign policy, the increasingly obvious ineffectiveness of what he's doing to discredit himself and to lead other Republicans to begin to say, this is too much and we have to have different leadership, different policies, or at least to be more critical. Let me stop there. I want to hear what you guys have to say. It's been a long time since we've had a sustained foreign policy discussion together. What am I leaving out? Are there things that you would add? Are there things you disagree with or need more information on? Who wants to start us out today? Go ahead, Sandy.
Isn't I think that we are leaving out the fact that Trump family benefits from a lot of his negotiations, that he personally is making a lot of money.
Thank you, Sandy. And I avoided speculating, right, with the pardoning of Hernandez. Is there some big purchase of Trump cryptocurrency, right, that's ultimately lurking in the background and that will eventually come to the fore, right? And the idea that obviously Witkoff seems to have some conflicts of interest as he serves as Trump's envoy in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And Trump has plenty of conflicts of interest. I think, I didn't even put the hosting of the Saudi prince in the White House last week on my slides. I easily could have, right? And the idea that the Trump family is gaining maybe billions of dollars from the Saudis. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. But having said that, just noting the corruption, maybe it's one further explanation for the slapdash and unstable nature of our policy. But I tend to want to concentrate on, if there are objectives, how poorly calibrated the strategy and the implementation is to pursue those objectives. Presumably, Donald Trump is not going to say out loud that the objective is to enrich the Trump family. Yeah. Mike, are you raising your hand? Go ahead, as long as we're on you guys.
I want to note, as a supplement to what Sandy said, that the Whitcomb family is integral partners with the Trump family in their maneuvers to enrich themselves to Bitcoin.
Yeah, yeah, and I think enough said. And by the way, you know, yeah, I didn't get into the economics of all this and the tariffs and the interdependence because just time didn't permit today. But I think there's growing signs that we are in the middle of a tech bu bubble, right? And Mohammed El-Arian, I don't know if you saw, wrote in the New York Times, it may be a rational bubble, right, as opposed to an irrational bubble. There is such a thing, right, as a whole bunch of speculative money going into a technology like AI and the adjacent investment in crypto, I just can't see making any sense. Maybe I'm missing something. But having said that, at least the AI bubble is motivated by the fact that the company that gets this right or the companies that actually do this are going to be hugely profitable, and so you should bet on them now, right? But at the same time, a whole bunch of them can crash, right? Because only one or two or three are going to win this battle, and everybody else is going to be left holding companies and stocks that just don't pan out and that aren't worth anything. And so the idea that there may be, as you probably saw, a techno crash occurring right now, but that there may be a broader economic crash coming is part of the complexity of the intertangling of all of these countries, the interdependencies, the investments, the way in which the US dollar, despite all of these problems, is still the global currency, the US Treasury, despite all of the increased debt. And please note, right, that the tariffs are in front of the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court decides that the tariffs were illegal, then, right, there's going to be billions or trillions of dollars refunded to the countries and companies from whom the tariffs were collected, and a big additional hole in the deficit opened up. Yeah, there's an awful lot of tangled web in the financial side of all of this. Thank you, Mike. Anybody else with a thought or a comment? I'm looking around. Rose, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself.
I want to talk about the peace plan
Yes.
and how it's been violated consistently. In the past 44 days, it's been violated 500 times. Civilians are killed. Israel is preventing aid from getting into Gaza. And where's the teeth in this? I mean, who is going to assure us? I mean, I don't see how it means anything, really. Hamas is an idea. You know, they're never going to obliterate Hamas. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry, Rose. I mean, be sorry for the abysmal circumstances you're describing, but not for raising it. I think it's extremely important. And I'm not sure, how much I have to add to what you're saying, but yes, let us note to begin with, right, that the fact that the United Nations has the Security Council has adopted the peace plan gives cover for Qatar or UAE or Kuwait, Egypt, maybe, to be able to send troops, right? They couldn't do it as long as it was just the United States. But please note also, right, that no sane country wants to send their troops on a peacekeeping mission to a hot conflict zone, right? And as you point out, there are multiple violations or multiple forms of aggression occurring with Israel in Lebanon, the West Bank, but especially Gaza, and that this is going to dissuade troops from coming and keeping peace. And the really hard part of this plan, right, is going to be, as you point out, Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a civil society organization. Hamas is also a government and a terrorist organization, right? It's a really hard to pin down multi-headed hydra of an
Right.
organization. And the peace plan calls for disarming Hamas, right? Who's going to do that, right? And and so yes, the Israeli right, the Netanyahu government has absolutely no interest in this plan succeeding to get out of stage one and into stage two, in which, right, they begin to redevelop Gaza and begin to allow the Palestinian Authority in as an alternative government. By the way, Hamas has absolutely no interest in that either, right? And so, yes, I agree that this plan has very limited prospects for success. And then let us just add part of, right, my motif today is that Donald Trump is not a serious foreign policy thinker. He doesn't have sustained energy or attention, let alone experience and ideas, right? And that this kind of complex plan would only succeed with the sustained and vigorous investment of U.S. prestige and resources in bringing it to fruition. So yes, I'm inclined to think, Donald Trump, I don't know how the man thinks. I have no desire to be inside his head. But the idea that he thinks he's going to get a peace prize by cooking up a plan that he doesn't actually invest in implementing, that he's going to get a peace prize while blowing boats out of the water in the Caribbean in what is clearly a violation of international law, clearly, in a sense, criminal conduct, right? Yeah, that this peace plan is better, I want to be clear, than outright ongoing warfare, right? That we were on the verge, in many respects we still are, of sustained and disastrous famine in Gaza. If the aid can get in, it's better than active conflict, but it's not peace and it's not stable and it's unlikely to do better. Rose, did you want to follow?
I just want to add one more thing. Of course, we've been financing Israel in this war for years and sending arms. And it's been pointed out by many that if we cease to do that, perhaps there could be some progress. But we're never going to cease to do that, apparently.
Not
That's all
under
I want to
this
say.
administration for sure, but not under the previous administration either.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Thank
All right,
you.
Rose, thank you. David, I see you've got your hand up. I'll let you have the last question for today.
Well, I just I agree with all the things you're saying about the foreign policy and the like, but when it comes to Donald Trump, I think we've also always got to factor in his experience as a deal maker and his penchant for doing whatever it is that comes to his mind at 2 o'clock in the morning. And a lot of this is about creating uncertainty and sowing chaos and keeping people off balance so that he can find his way into make a deal that ultimately benefits, as Sandy and Mike said, him. But I think there's always that, I'm a deal maker and I sow chaos and I keep people off balance.
Yeah, I know somebody who is a contractor, supplies basically labor, but it's a technical labor and construction projects in New York, and who has worked on a few Donald Trump projects. And he said to me that there's almost no one who works with Donald Trump twice in New York construction, right? And so to say that he's a deal maker, right? He makes deals and he breaks deals. He makes deals and he doesn't
Mhm.
follow through. He is simply someone who tries to maximize his short-term advantage in every transaction he participates in. At least that's my impression of Donald Trump from this man and from having read about him fairly extensively in the business world, right? And by the way, right, I should have said some of this. I think I've spoken with you about it before, but international relations, right? It's worthwhile noting the relations dimension to that name, right? That what is really stable, what is really potentially powerful, structuring and secure is having built long-term relations with allies that transcend the current leadership, that are rooted in, right, the bureaucracies of foreign policy, but also in the deep trust between societies and their elites, and that Donald Trump's, right, short-term strategic myopia in pursuing these policies is doing deep damage to those relations. And I think increasingly the people of the world are saying Donald Trump may be an aberration, right? You know, it's not the case that Donald Trump is going to be president forever. But if the United States elects him twice, what does that say about the people or the political system of the United States? Are we so fractured? Is our system of government so broken that we can no longer be relied upon to maintain the carefully cultivated, long-standing relations that our foreign policy is built on? And if so, then the damage that Donald Trump does by his short-term strategic orientation to deal making and relations is not just a problem for the next 3 years. It may be a problem for the next 30 years, I'm sorry to say. All right, everyone, on that cheery note, I do hope you had good Thanksgivings, and I am, as I said last week, thankful for being able to be with you every week and for the consolation, but also the support and the strength we get from talking this stuff through together. Be well, have good weeks. I'll see everybody next week. Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
David.
Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
guys. Thank you.